I used to believe that anniversaries meant something, not because of the flowers or the gifts or the expensive dinners, but because they were proof that two people had chosen each other again and again, even when it wasn't easy. 22 years of marriage felt like something solid, something earned. When Mark told me he wanted to plan a real celebration this year, something bigger than usual, I thought maybe he finally felt the same way. He said he wanted it to be memorable, a private room at a nice restaurant, close friends, good wine. He even mentioned how proud he was that we'd made it this far, how not many couples do anymore. I remember standing in the kitchen, nodding, smiling, feeling that small, warm hope that maybe the distance I'd felt lately was just a phase. Because there had been distance. I wasn't blind to that. Mark had become quieter over the past year, more protective of his phone, more irritable when I asked simple questions. Work trips increased, late nights became normal. But when you've spent decades with someone, you don't immediately assume betrayal. You assume stress. You assume midlife crisis. You assume it will pass. 3 weeks before the anniversary dinner, I came home early from work. A meeting was canceled last minute, and instead of going for coffee or shopping, I decided to head home. I remember thinking I'd surprise him, maybe suggest we order takeout and watch a movie like we used to. I parked down the street because our driveway was full, which was strange since Mark had said he was working from home alone that day. The house was quiet when I walked in, too quiet. Then I heard his voice coming from the living room. He was on the phone, and the tone of his voice immediately stopped me in my tracks. It wasn't the distracted, tired voice I was used to hearing. It was warm, intimate, almost playful. I didn't mean to listen, I really didn't, but when you hear your husband laugh like that, when he hasn't laughed with you in months, your body reacts before your mind can catch up. I stood there, half hidden by the hallway wall, my keys still in my hand. "I've already talked to my lawyer," he said, low and confident. "She won't see it coming." My chest tightened. He continued, "I'll serve her the papers on our anniversary, public place, no drama, she won't dare make a scene." There was a pause, then a soft laugh on the other end of the line, a woman's laugh, young, light, the kind of laugh that hasn't been worn down by years of compromise. Mark went on, almost amused. "She thinks the house is ours, but I've got that handled. I'm not walking away with nothing. After everything I've put into this marriage, I deserve it." Deserve it? I felt like the floor shifted under my feet. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid he'd hear it through the walls. He talked about me like I was a problem he'd solved, a situation he'd managed. 22 years reduced to a strategy. I didn't hear everything after that. My ears were ringing, my hands shaking. At some point, I quietly backed away, stepped outside, and sat in my car. I stared straight ahead, gripping the steering wheel, replaying his words over and over. "Serve her the papers. She won't see it coming. She won't make a scene." I didn't cry, not then. The shock was too complete, too heavy. Crying felt like something I'd do later, when I was alone and safe. Right then, all I felt was a strange, cold clarity settling in. I realized something important in that moment. Mark thought he knew me. He thought I was predictable, passive, easy to outmaneuver. He thought I would freeze, that I would beg, that I would be too embarrassed to react. He was wrong. I didn't confront him that day. I didn't mention the call. I went back inside later, acted like nothing had happened, listened to him complain about work, nodded at the right moments. That night, as he slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and made a decision. If he was planning to end our marriage like it was a performance, I didn't change my behavior after that meeting. That was the hardest part, pretending that nothing had shifted, that my entire understanding of my marriage hadn't cracked open. Mark came and went as usual, kissed my cheek absently, talked about work stress, complained about traffic. I listened. I nodded. I stored everything away. Inside, though, I was moving carefully, deliberately. I started making copies of everything: bank statements, credit card records, screenshots of hotel bookings. I organized them by date, by amount, by location. I didn't rush. I wanted the story the numbers told to be impossible to argue with. Late nights in Chicago that coincided with jewelry purchases, weekend seminars that aligned perfectly with beachfront resorts. Every new detail hurt, but it also strengthened something in me. The more I saw, the clearer it became that Mark hadn't just fallen out of love. He had decided I was expendable, a supporting character in a life he wanted to rewrite without me. A few days later, he mentioned the anniversary dinner again. He was excited, almost giddy, which made my stomach turn. He talked about the restaurant, the private room, how everyone would be there. I smiled and said it sounded lovely. He suggested I wear the navy dress he liked, the one he always said made me look elegant. I agreed. I wondered if he realized how cruel it was to dress me up for my own ambush. That night, lying in bed, I stared at his back and thought about all the small moments I'd dismissed over the years, the times he'd brushed off my concerns, the jokes at my expense in front of friends, the way he'd started correcting me in public, as if slowly rewriting the narrative of who I was. I realize now that this wasn't sudden. This was the final act of something that had been unraveling for a long time. My lawyer and I spoke often in those weeks. She was calm, methodical, never dramatic. She explained things in a way that made the chaos feel manageable: the misuse of joint funds, the fact that the house was not a marital asset, the implications of serving papers publicly. She advised me to let him go through with it. "Let him think he's in control," she said. "People make the biggest mistakes when they're confident." So I did. I let him plan. I let him believe his version of events was unfolding perfectly. I even thanked him for putting in the effort, for making our anniversary special. He smiled in that tight way that now looked more like relief than affection. As the dinner approached, I noticed how nervous he became. He checked his phone constantly. He rehearsed conversations out loud when he thought I wasn't listening. Once I heard him say my name followed by a sigh, as if he were practicing how to say goodbye. The day of the anniversary arrived quietly. I got dressed carefully, not for him, but for myself. I wore the navy dress, styled my hair, applied my makeup with steady hands. I looked at myself in the mirror longer than usual. I didn't see a woman about to be discarded. I saw someone who had survived 22 years and was about to reclaim herself. The restaurant was exactly as he described: elegant, soft lighting, a private room filled with familiar faces. Friends hugged us, congratulated us, raised glasses to our marriage. Mark played his part well. He laughed, he told stories, he squeezed my hand when people weren't looking, his palm slightly damp. Dinner moved slowly, course after course. I could feel the tension in him building, like a clock counting down. When dessert arrived, he cleared his throat and stood up. The room quieted instinctively, everyone sensing that something was coming. "I want to say something," he began, his voice steady but strained. "This marriage has been a big part of my life." My heart beat calmly, surprisingly so. "But sometimes," he continued, "people grow apart, and pretending otherwise doesn't help anyone." There were confused glances around the table. Someone laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. "I think honesty is important," he said, "so I want to be honest tonight." He gestured toward the door. A moment later, she walked in. She was younger than me, effortlessly confident, dressed like she belonged there. Her smile was wide and expectant. She stood beside him as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I've met someone," Mark said, "and I'm filing for divorce." Gasps filled the room. Someone whispered my name. He pulled an envelope from his jacket and placed it. The air outside the restaurant felt colder than I expected, even though it was a mild evening. I stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, listening to the muffled sounds of confusion and raised voices coming from inside. I didn't wait to hear what Mark was saying or how he was trying to explain himself. None of it mattered anymore. What mattered was that I had taken back control of my own story. The drive home felt unreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold from a distance. I kept waiting for the shock to hit, for my hands to start shaking, for tears to come. But instead, there was a strange calm, a quiet certainty that whatever came next would be built on truth, not lies. Mark didn't come home that night. I slept alone in the bed we had shared for decades, and for the first time in a long while, I slept deeply. No tossing, no racing thoughts, just rest. The next morning, my phone was full of messages, friends asking if I was okay, confused apologies from people who hadn't known what to say in the moment, a few messages from Mark himself, swinging wildly between anger and desperation. I didn't reply to any of them. I forwarded everything from Mark to my lawyer and muted his number. The legal process moved faster than I expected. Once the paperwork was filed, the tone shifted immediately. Mark went from confident to defensive almost overnight. He demanded meetings, explanations, compromises. He accused me of humiliating him, of ruining everything by making things public. The irony didn't escape me. Through my lawyer, I learned more than I'd ever wanted to know. The affair hadn't just been emotional or recent. It had been going on for nearly 2 years. He told her I was cold, controlling, obsessed with money. He'd painted himself as a trapped man, sacrificing everything for a wife who didn't appreciate him. The truth, laid out in bank statements and emails, told a very different story. The misuse of joint funds became a central issue. Every gift, every trip, every expense was documented. Mark tried to argue that it was his money too, but the judge didn't see it that way, especially not when those funds had been spent secretly on an extramarital relationship while he was planning to leave. Then there was the house. Watching his reaction when he realized he had no claim to it was almost painful. Almost. He had assumed for years that it was his safety net, that no matter how things ended, he would walk away with something solid. Losing that illusion hit him harder than the affair being exposed. The woman he'd brought to the dinner didn't stay long. Once it became clear that there would be no house, no easy settlement, no comfortable transition into a better life, her interest faded quickly. She stopped answering his calls. She stopped showing up to meetings. The confidence she'd walked in with vanished as soon as reality set in. Mark's world began to shrink. Friends distanced themselves. Invitations stopped coming. At work, the whispers turned into formal conversations. His company prided itself on its public image, and the very public nature of his behavior didn't sit well with management. Within a few months, he was let go. Officially, it was a restructuring. Unofficially, everyone knew why. He tried to come back then. He wrote long emails about regret, about how he'd been confused, about how he'd lost sight of what mattered. He talked about our history, about the life we'd built, about second chances. I read them once, then archived them. Some things can't be unlearned. Some betrayals don't get a redo. The divorce was finalized quietly. No drama, no courtroom theatrics, just signatures and stamped papers. I kept the house. I recovered a significant portion of the misused funds. He walked away with debt, legal fees, and the consequences of his own decisions. After it was over, the silence in the house felt different. Not heavy, not lonely, just open. I redecorated slowly, intentionally. I moved furniture, I painted walls, I removed things that reminded me of who I'd been trying to be for someone else. People told me I was strong, brave, graceful. I didn't feel like any of those things. I felt free. One afternoon, months later, a letter arrived in the mail, handwritten, Mark's name on the envelope. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. I burned the letter that same evening, not out of anger, but out of closure. I watched the paper curl and darken, the words disappearing into ash, and with them went the last obligation I felt to explain myself or forgive him out loud. Some endings don't need responses. They just need to be accepted. Life didn't suddenly become perfect after that. Healing isn't a montage. There were quiet mornings when the house felt too big, and nights when old habits made me reach for my phone before I remembered there was no one to update, no one to check in with. But those moments passed, and each time they did, they left a little more space behind. I started doing things I'd put off for years. I traveled alone. I took classes just because I wanted to. I reconnected with friends I'd slowly faded away from while trying to keep a marriage afloat. The more I lived in my own rhythm, the more I realized how much of myself I'd compressed to fit into a life that no longer wanted me. Occasionally, I'd hear things about Mark, that he'd moved again, that he was struggling, that he talked about me like I was the one who'd changed. I didn't correct the stories. I didn't need to. People eventually see patterns for what they are. On the anniversary of the night everything ended, I didn't go out. I stayed home, I cooked a simple meal, I sat on the porch as the sun went down, the house quiet behind me, solid and still, the same house he'd once believed would be his reward. I thought about how close I'd come to being blindsided, how easily his plan could have worked if I hadn't walked in at the wrong moment, if I hadn't listened, if I hadn't paid attention. And I understood something then that I hadn't before. Sometimes the greatest betrayal isn't the affair or the lies. It's the assumption that you're too small, too passive, too unimportant to fight back. He thought I would be humiliated. Instead, I walked away with my dignity, my future, and my life intact. And that was enough.